All right. Hello and welcome back. This is lecture 4 of the Star Wars Prequels series. And this is probably my favorite lecture out of all of them because, well, we established in the previous lecture, Anakin doesn't know who he is. And this is going to be the period. This is going to be the lecture in which he figures out who he is. And, well, not in the way that you'd expect and not in the way that you probably should develop who you are. So we are going to get into that today, and it starts with, well, the origin. It starts with how we are actually, we'll say, cultured to be, and that starts with the child, right? It starts with how you are as a child, and I'm gonna make sure in this lecture, I'm gonna make sure to bring this idea into multiple different levels and multiple different layers of the argument because, well, this is not only a love story, right? We like to think of this story of Anakin as a love story. And the reason why he falls to the dark side, you could say, is because of love and because of possession. But it's so much more than that. And it's something that I think we miss. I think we really, really miss. And if we only want to look at the surface level, you could say that. But there's a lot deeper. There's a lot deeper that you could go. And I wanted to emphasize this point right before I get started. When you watch this lecture or listen to this lecture, there's a tendency to think of Anakin, right? There's a tendency to think of the villains in any story as the other, right? As, oh yeah, that's somebody on the other side of the political aisle. That's somebody on the other who exists outside of our national boundaries. Somebody who exists somewhere outside of us. My enemy is the villain. But the way that we're going to look at this is to come to this unfortunate reality, which actually Luke ends up coming up with in Star Wars 5. It's this evil, this dark side, is something that exists within you. It's not a... Well, if you could say that evil is something that exists within the world, then it would be very, very ignorant and very, very naive to say that ignorance is not something that exists within you. Because the person who has evil that you're deflecting or projecting upon, right? You could say someone like Hitler, whatever, right? He's a human too. You're a human too. What makes you think that you don't have the same blood that Hitler has? What makes you think that you don't have the same potential for evil that Hitler has? Well, that's the dark side conceptualized. We could say that Hitler is the extreme evil, but, there's a lot of evil that exists within you that, well, you need to discover, and that's something that Anakin starts to discover in this. And one of the main, we'll say, breakthroughs that I've had in my life is this realization that my life is a constant flux between the light side and the dark side, right? Symbolically speaking. My life, every single day, I spend some time on the light side and some time on the dark side. There's no day in which my day was all good. And when I think of something as the dark side, something externalized, like a political regime or someone like Hitler, I don't realize that, well, in my life, I spend much of my time in the dark side. You imagine something like procrastination, which I brought up in my last lecture. It's like, that's the representation of taking the easy way out, and it's also the representation of, well, not bearing the responsibilities of a human being, right? Distracting yourself from the world. And it's like, what more do you need to say that is the dark side, right? Actually, George Lucas said, he goes, the dark side is taking the easy way out. That's one possible way of looking at it. And by taking this archetypal reality of the dark side, turning into Darth Vader and really localizing it and saying, maybe it's any action in which I do that I know to be wrong and I do it anyways. It's like, that's a good conceptualization of the dark side anyways. And, well, now, anytime I usually have different representations for it, but anytime I waste my time, for example, procrastinate, do anything like that, I don't say, Nick, you're lazy. I don't say, Nick, you're doing whatever, you're being stupid. I say, Nick, you're turning into Darth Vader. I say, Nick, you're turning into name archetypal villain who turned to the dark side, something like that. And it changes my perspective because it really says, wait a second, in this moment, you're not just being lazy, you're doing something that is eternally bad. And one of the archetypes that we haven't explored yet, but we'll eventually explore, is the idea that you fall one sin at a time, right? One sin at a time, one little problem, one little mistake. It's like those start to kind of, well, stack up upon each other, and then eventually you're in a ditch, metaphorically speaking, or not metaphorically speaking, and you hope you never made the first mistake. So you see that with addiction all the time. You see that with something like overeating. I see that all the time. Smoking too. Smoking's a huge one. But anyways, so that's the real idea here. So we're gonna look at Anakin from that lens, from the lens that he is you and you are him. So what happens is we're gonna start with layer 1, right? Layer 1 is very simple. When you are younger, you leave your parents. Right? You leave your parents. And this is what Anakin does. So I'll give you the surface level. So he says, this is as he's leaving his mom. And we could say the mom right now is Mother Mary, right? She's the perfect representation of a mother. And we could say that's how he sees her, right? He sees her as the perfect mom. It's like, okay, good, right? One of the ideas that Jung talked about was that when we look upon somebody, we give them a specific image, right? Because you don't know everything about every person that you see because, well, we're incredibly complex and we like to simplify the world. So, like, when I speak to you, I'm not going to tell you about my deepest, darkest, vulnerable problems, and I'm also not going to tell you about the greatest experiences that I've ever had. I'm just going to kind of keep it on the surface level. And so what we do is, as humans, we kind of fill in the gaps, and we see what we want to see, right? That's maybe one of our fundamental problems, and this is the problem that Anakin has with his mom. He projects upon her, right? Because this is the way that she's depicted. He projects upon her, she is the perfect mother. She is the mother that has made no flaws. And you see, well, people, including me, do the same thing with their parents, right? With their fathers. What you do is you look at your father and you say, okay, he is the perfect person. Right? He's the perfect person. He has no flaws and he has no problems. And, well, the unfortunate reality is, first of all, of course he has problems because we're humans and, well, of course we're going to have problems. But what we're going to do is, no matter what, we're just going to project the perfect image upon them. And that's what Anakin does when he projects this idea of Mother Mary upon his mother. And he says, essentially, because of that, he says, I don't want to leave. Right? Why would I want to leave if I'm in a place where I'm perfectly projected, perfectly protected, and I have my mother to give me comfort, to give me ease, you know? And so that's layer 1. But she says, but you can't stop the change any more than you could stop the suns from setting. And we'll get into that idea later, but what she's really doing is she's saying, hey, listen, change, right? You got to be able to change. You got to be able to roll with the tides, and you got to be able to go. So what happens is he says, okay, I'm going to go, and, well, he leaves, right? He leaves, and automatically on the ship as he's leaving, what does he do? He meets Padme, right? And sort of, well, not meets Padme, but he gets comforted by Padme. Padme sort of, she says, you know, you miss your mother, and sort of fills in the gap for him. And, well, the problem here is that, so it's a good thing, right? It's a good thing that we could say he has this, we'll say, dependency, right? And she fills his dependency for him. He depends upon his mother, and she fulfills some sort of motherly role in him. We could say maybe that's good, right? Maybe that's good, but it's not that incredible. So, and I think maybe you could understand why, but we'll definitely explain that in the deeper layers. So then, by the time that he gets older, right, he says, I've been thinking about her all the time, right? I essentially projected my image of my mom upon her, and they end up falling in love, right? And you have the whole love story that exists between them. And we'll start with that for now. So this is layer 1, right? Layer 1 is very simple. It's like, okay, you have your image of your parents, and you think of them as too highly. So what do you end up doing? You, don't want to move on. You don't want to develop your own individual self. You just want to remain stuck to your parents. And this really plays out, and I'll explain layer one. An example for layer one is very simple. Your career, right? Let's say your mother, in this case, or your father is an accountant, right? If they're an accountant, then they're probably going to want you to be an accountant, or a lawyer, or a doctor, or name whatever high status position that exists. And this could also be a representation of culture, right? Same idea. It's like you could say your parents want you to be a doctor, lawyer, accountant, or your culture wants you to be one because, that's how status works. And let's say as a child, because you're dependent on them, you say, oh, that's a pretty good idea. That's a pretty good idea. I kind of like that. And so what do? Let's say you finally get some independence. You finally separate from your parents. And, maybe this is the opportunity for you to be able to think for yourself. Instead of thinking, wait a second, what do my parents want? What does society want for me? What do I actually want for me? That is exactly what college is for. College is for determining, okay, I actually had a conversation with my friend about this the other day. She said, I believe that the fundamental purpose of college, or the fundamental purpose of life in general, is, first to discover who you are and what you like, and then second of all, to pick a career that suits that. It's very simple. The unfortunate reality is, when you first gain your independence and when you first try to discover, what possibly exists in the world for me, you have no idea who you really are. You have zero idea who you really are. You have zero idea who you like. I speak about this all the time I talk to college freshmen. And when I speak to them, I say, hey, what do you want? And, what do you want to do? The simple, what career do you want to choose? And overwhelmingly, I get the idea of finance, accounting, right? All of these investment bankers on Wall Street. I want to be this. And I ask them, why do you want to be that? And they're like, because it makes money. It's the typical answer. And I know they're kind of lying, right? They say, the answer is because it makes money, because it makes status, and my parents like it, right? It's like, okay, that's the full answer. And, the problem is, you never developed your individual self. You never figured out what you like and who you are. Because if you don't figure out that, then you're just going to be, let's say, a mold of your either culture or parents. So this is what Anakin fails to do, right? He fails to become his own individual self. What he does is he clings upon Padme. And the representation of his mother is simply just brought over to Padme. And the representation there for something like a career is, your parents want you to be an accountant, so you become an accountant. Or at least for a while you plan on becoming an accountant, right? And that sounds about right? How often do we see something like that? It's not a big thing. And it's not hard to realize why people do that. It's like you have a set path in front of you. You have all the options. You have security. We laid out everything for you. We're a good parent, and we laid out everything that we want for you. And everything that will bring you peace and security, we'll say. And you say, okay, I'll take it. Right? It's like, that's great. That's great. Of course I'll take the $100,000, $200,000 salary and good security. It's like, of course I'll do that. But the only problem is, are you going to like it? Is that what you want? And, so that's the problem with careers. And then, so you end up, right, what ends up happening with Anakin is he becomes something like obsessed with it, right? Or it takes over his mind. So he says, okay, I want to be a finance major. Very simple. Now, we're going to move on to layer 2, and then we're going to develop a little bit deeper into the story, because that's a little too surface level. Level 2 is something like, first of all, we'll keep going. So then what happens is, so he falls in love, right? And very simply, when he falls in love, he goes into the state of paradise. Look how beautiful this place is, and this is the way that they depict it. It's on the planet of Naboo, and we could say Padme, in this case, is the representation of a career, right? It's the representation of, partially innocence. That's part of it, because if you look at the way that they depicted Padme, she's very similar in the way that they depicted Anakin's mom. Like, she definitely has some more sensual elements to her, but she's depicted as essentially perfect, just like the mom. She has no problems, no flaws up until, well, the whole time. She really has no flaws the whole time. So, love is depicted as paradise, and we could say this is almost the childish paradise in which innocence lies, right? This is the Garden of Eden in the biblical stories. It's like, this is not real, but it's comforting. It's comforting, and that's the world in which Anakin lives in right now. So he says, I want to be a finance major, and what he's really saying is, well, I'm going to live a blissful life. I'm going to live a great life. I think I'm going to live a great life, but really, I'm just ignoring the real world. So what ends up happening is he gets rejected, right? She rejects him, and there's a lot of reasoning behind that, but we'll get into that in the third movie. And she rejects him. He says, I want to get into a relationship, right? We'll say, from a career perspective, it's very simple. It's like, I want to be with you, right? If he's talking to accounting, metaphorically speaking, or finance, he's saying, I want to be with you. And she rejects him. So maybe this could be a representation of the internal rejection of, wait a second, you ask yourself, do I really like accounting? Like, do I really care about this? So what happens is, right, he gets rejected. And very simply, what ends up happening? He goes back home, right? Why does he go back home? He goes back home to Tatooine. And the idea there is very simple. It's like, you get rejected, right? When he was home, when he was on Tatooine in the beginning, that was when he formed his idea of the perfect whatever, right? But he got rejected. But there was a problem, right? There's a problem in his plan. So what do you have to do? You have to go back to where you were before, right? You have to go back to where you established the presupposition in the first place to, well, see if it was right. So that's what he does. He goes back to his homeland, right? And he finds out that his mother, right, the perfect archetypal mother, has been taken by, let's say, something like animals. And he goes out to find her, and she dies, right? So that's layer one, right? And so she dies, and now he's left with this choice, right? From a career perspective, very simple. It's like, well, what do I want to do, right? What do I want to do? The presupposition that I made in the first place of, I want to be an accountant because my parents, society, whatever, wants me to be an accountant. It's like, he figures out that that's wrong. That's the symbolism of his mom dying. He figures out that the presupposition that he initially made, the perfect image that he projected upon his mom, upon his parents, upon society, upon culture, was wrong. And now he's left with this question of, do I want to develop my own individual self? Am I going to establish am I going to get out of paradise? Am I going to leave this blissful existence that is here? And he decides, he decides to kill all the animals, which is essentially saying, I wasn't ready to handle it. I wasn't ready for my entire conceptual scheme to blow up, and I'm not even going to try to come up with some new ideas. So that's level one. Level two is a better representation, and it's deeper. It's deeper. It's not necessarily better. It's deeper. So what happens is, this is cool. This is really, really cool. So what happens is, you imagine that as a child, you are incredibly dependent upon your parents. Very simple idea. From the time you come out of the womb, for the first year of your life, you are literally fully dependent upon your, we'll say mother, but caregiver. We'll say mother for these purposes. And, well, the problem with that is you have to learn how to operate within their rules because, well, you need them, right? You need your parents. So what happens is you develop a sense of, well, just unconsciousness. Like, you imagine that as a young child, you are unconscious completely. And, well, that's about right. That's about right. You're completely dependent, and you don't really have to think. This is it, right? You don't have to think for yourself. Yeah, and I've seen it. Like, I've seen it across all of the dimensions. You know, a great representation is, you know, I see this all the time. It's like parents, right? Parents, they teach their kids, they're like, you have to do, let's say, homework, or you have to be good in school, right? And what ends up happening is, okay, that's fine, right? So they go through their high school career, they go through their middle school career, all of it, and they're good in school. And you could say that's a good thing, right? But by the time that they come to college and are released from the clutches of their parents, well, unfortunately, they don't know how to handle themselves. They don't know how to handle themselves, and they completely fall apart. They never learned how to think for themselves. They were always completely dependent. And, well, you imagine why the dropout rate in college is something like 40%. It's like, that's why. That's why. So, that's the representation here of the mother. Right? And of course he's going to be dependent because, well, and he's not going to want things to change because, of course, he's not going to want to lose his dependency. He's not going to want to think for himself. So we could say this is the emergence of self-consciousness, right? The emergence of being able to think for yourself. And, well, being an adult, right? That is maturity in a nutshell. The idea of adulting, right? Like, like becoming responsible and developing responsibilities. So what does he do? Automatically, he says, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do anything like that. I'm going to just become dependent upon something else. Instead of being dependent upon my mother, I'm going to be dependent upon Padme. It's like, okay, right? Now you can kind of understand why he becomes possessive over her and why he develops such a strong attachment over her. And this is why he says, I've thought about her every single day since we parted. It's like she's taking the mother role within him, and they fall in love, right? And then they go to paradise, right? And when I say paradise, well, what is the representation of paradise in the Garden of Eden, for example? Right? The Garden of Eden it's perfect bliss. It's the place that's not actual reality. It doesn't exist on earth. It exists in the heavens. And, well, the problem is you're rejecting yourself from the world. So Anakin, in his chance to leave his mother and develop his own sense of individuality, his own sense of thinking, to be able to, well, think for himself, he decides, no, I'm just going to run away, and I'm going to, well, I'm going to go to blissful paradise. It's like, that's fine, but that's not the real world. You know, that's the idea in The Lion King, right? In The Lion King, it's very simple. It's like Simba's mom dies, or Simba's dad dies. Mufasa, we could say that's leaving him. And where does he go? He goes to Hakuna Matata, right? What is Hakuna Matata? Hakuna Matata is, well, it means no worries for the rest of your days, right? No responsibilities, a problem-free philosophy, right? That's the idea. And it's like, well, you could just live in a blissful state and just not have to worry about anything. You don't have to become an adult. You could just remain unconscious. And, well, that's fine, right? That's fine. But you're going to have to come back. You're going to have to come back at some time, because by the time, well, that's the idea of the 30-year-old living in his mother's basement. It's like, you never became an adult. You might be 30. You might be technically an adult, but you never became an adult. You never separated from your parents, and you never stopped becoming dependent, right? That's the idea of them living in the mother's basement. It's like you're still dependent upon your parents. Why? Because you never developed any sense of responsibility, individuality, or meaning, for that matter. So what's the thing that wakes him up, right? What's the thing that wakes up Anakin? In Lion King, Nala comes in, and she says, hey, listen, what the hell are you doing, right? Like she says, you have to come back, you have to be an adult, and it's your responsibility to do that. So what does Padme do? She does exactly that. She rejects him, right? And that's the worst thing, especially for a guy. It's like, okay, you can live in your blissful existence and do whatever, but by the time that you realize that, wait a second, the 30-year-old in his mother's basement doesn't get the girl. It's something like, who's the guy in 50 Shades of Grey? Christian Grey, who's a billionaire and essentially has climbed to the top of the, well, masculine hierarchy, right? He's gotten all the money, and so he gets rejected. Right? And now let's let's break it apart, right? So what does he do? He says, okay, I'm going to come back to reality. I'm going to come back home. I'm going to come back to Tatooine, where, according to the same idea, I formed my original presuppositions. And this is what you do in therapy, right? That's exactly what therapy is. You say, okay, I'm going to explore where I became dependent. I'm going to explore where I stopped becoming an individual. And this goes back to the idea of, first of all, right, we go back to this idea of paradise, right? The idea of paradise. I told you before, right, that my friend, she said the basic idea of college, right, the basic goal of college, or the basic goal of becoming a human, is leaving your parents, right, leaving dependency on structure, culture, whatever, parents, then figuring out who you are and what you like, right? That would be something like determining your own internal reality and then acting that out in the world, right? That's really what it is. So she said, turn it into a career. And I say, act that out into the world. It's the same idea. It's just a broader way of looking at it. And, I bring up Hakuna Matata for a really funny reason. You know, I spend a lot of time in college, right? And the funny thing about college is, what is the main problem that everybody recognizes is wrong with college? It's that people drink too much, right? People drink too much, they smoke too much, play too many video games, watch too much TV, you name it, it's there, right? Social media is a big problem in college, right? It's, all of it. We could label those as something like, you could label them as two things. One, you could label them on the surface level as distractors. It's like, okay, they're distractors, right? But the question is, distracting you from what, right? Distracting you from, it's the second point, becoming an individual, developing who you are, discovering what you actually like. And that's the real, or the worldly manifestation of Hakuna Matata. That's the real representation of Anakin going to this paradisal state before he gets rejected. What he's really saying is, this is the problem with drinking. It's like, I don't really know who I am, and my problem is that I'm not conscious, right? I never became self-conscious because most of my life I've been dependent upon my parents, which is fair, right? But it's like, okay, now I need to develop my self-consciousness. What do? I do exactly the things that destroy my self-consciousness, which is drink, right? Drinking is the number one thing that's like, all right, you cease to become a human, you more resemble an animal. And because you're shutting off the human part of your brain, your cortex. And, that's why it's a problem, right? The reason why drinking and everything, right, distractions, procrastination, all these things are a problem is because you're living in this paradisal state of Naboo, right? You're living in this Hakuna Matata state. What you're doing is you're really distracting yourself from the world. You're distracting yourself from reality that exists, and therefore you are unconscious. You are not bearing the, problems and suffering of reality. So now we have the right idea there. Now, let's take it and we say, okay, he gets rejected. He goes back to Tatooine. He says, I'm coming back to Earth because I need to, right? The blissful unconscious that I created was wrong, right? I realize now that it's wrong. So he goes back, gets rejected, says he's going back to Tatooine. Realizes now that maybe, right, the symbolism of his mother's death is very simple now. It's something like, maybe my mother was wrong, right? Or maybe, yeah, that's good, right? Maybe my mother was wrong, and maybe I have to let her go to be able to, become my own self, right? And that's what happens, and she dies, right? And she dies. And, you look at any superhero movie, and that's the exact idea, right? Batman's parents are killed. Superman's parents. Lion King. Superman. Iron Man. You get the point, right? Thor, and you have this idea of, okay, you got to separate from your parents. Why do you separate from your parents? Why is this the symbol of your parents dying? And it doesn't actually mean that your parents die. It just means that you let go of this God image. You let go of this, we'll say, perfect representation of them. Because that's exactly how we saw his mother in the past, and therefore you could develop your own individual self. This is the final opportunity for you to realize, maybe I want to be myself. Maybe I am not my father. And, well, that's a great idea, right? That's a great idea. So that's the symbol here of the rising and setting suns, right? The rising and setting suns is a very simple idea, and I explore this a lot deeper in Star Wars 4, because that's the like crux of it. It's like there's always going to be, no matter what's happening, there's always going to be a setting sun and a rising sun, right? This is the binary sunset idea, and it's maybe one of the most iconic ideas in all of cinema history, right? Luke staring out at the double suns and saying, well, maybe I'm more than I should be. That's the idea. It's like, okay, you have one sun is setting, the other is rising. Right? Life is always in flux. Life is always changing. And now, right, as he's going to watch his mother die, although he was holding on to the past, although he was holding on to, let's say, his mother, right, he was denying change. At this moment, no matter what happens, he's going to have to change. He's going to have to do it. And that's what the binary sunset means. Something dies and something lives and something rises. It doesn't matter whether it's good or bad. Right? It's just something's going to have to change. And this is Anakin's decision. So his mother dies. Clearly he's a little bit distraught from this, and he decides to go to essentially the dark side. He decides to be vengeful. And, well, this is when he kills the animals. And now I'm going to bring this idea down. Right? I'm going to bring it down to reality. And I'm going to say, when he decides to reject reality, he decides to reject his mother's death and just take it out in rage. And also, actually in the next idea, in the next scene, he says, life seems so much simpler when you're fixing things. Right? This is what he tells Padme. He says, I am struggling here. My mother just died. I just experienced a traumatic, life shift. And what is his solution? What is his solution? His goal should be to develop my self-consciousness and bear the suffering of the world, to bear the pain of the world and, conquer it, handle it, right? That's what God, name every hero, that's what they do. They conquer evil. They figure out how it's supposed to be. And his answer is, life seems so much simpler when you're fixing things. Life seems so much simpler when you're in an unconscious bliss and you don't have to handle the realities of the world. That's what he says. And okay, now let's ground that in reality. What does that mean, right? You procrastinate, right? You say, okay, I need to work on an assignment. I need to work on a project. And you say, no, I'll spend a few hours on watching a show before I get started. Or I'll spend a few hours watching, going on social media, whatever. Eating food. I think eating food is maybe the biggest distraction possible because, first of all, it fulfills the greatest biological desire, and then also it takes you out, it puts you in the most blissful state. Of course we love food. Same goes with sex, masturbation, that idea. And it's very simple. It's like, what do you do when you procrastinate? What you're doing is you're saying, if I want to work here, and I want to get my work done right now, that would require pain, suffering, and we'll say, I'm foregoing pleasure right now for the future, right? Because if I get my homework done now, then my life is going to be better. I'm going to graduate. And if I get my project done, then I'm not going to get fired, whatever. And, when you procrastinate, what are you really doing? What is it that you're really doing? You're saying, I can't bear the suffering of the world. I can't bear the pain of sitting down for an hour and, using this pain to make the current pain to make the future better. I can't bear this. I can't bear this suffering right now, so I'm just going to descend into a place of blissful unconscious. I'm just going to descend into TV, social media, food, whatever. It's like I'm going to go to a place in which I don't have to bear the suffering of the world. And that is the least heroic thing that you could possibly do. So that's what he does, unfortunately. And well, now he's, then he starts doubting himself, and then what happens is, so he fails, right? And then he becomes resentful, right? But then you have someone like Padme, who's the perfect representation of life as we get into it, and she says there are some things that nobody can fix. There are some things that, you just have to accept the change. You just have to do it. And that's something that Yoda's going to be saying a lot later. You have to let go. And that's exactly what his mom said in the beginning, right? His mom said, but you can't stop the change any more than you could stop the suns from setting. And now I think you understand the meaning of the binary sunset perfectly. It's like the binary sunset represents that change, life, flux is always going to be happening. And, you either run with it or you decide to, go back to comfort, go back to the unconsciousness from your mother, right? The unconsciousness from, you look at culture, society, conformity, your parents, right? And that's really what it is. That's what he decides to do. He decides to go back to the state of unconscious. And here is where we get into the third layer of what this means, right? And we're going to dig this a lot deeper, right? So now that we've established he wants to reject self-consciousness, he doesn't want to, think for himself. He doesn't want to establish his own individuality. We've got that established. Now, let's look at it from a relationship lens, right? We'll look at it from this is the literal lens of how it actually affects your relationship. You ask the question, why is it that men so often, and this is like the common trope that, our society doesn't really have a grasp on, we really don't understand why this happens, we just kind of leave it out. This is one of the things I've noticed. Why do men end up with women like their mothers? Why do women end up with men like their fathers? Why do women have these things called daddy issues? Why does that happen? Why do, we'll say, girls go for daddy issues is girls going for men that are like their fathers, but the thing is, their fathers were bad people. So why would they want to go for guys that are like their fathers if their fathers were bad people and, were emotionally distant and neglecting and all of these things? It's like, why does this happen? And what is the counter of that for men? And this explains it absolutely perfectly. What is the counter is probably the wrong word. Something like, the corresponding archetype. You asked the question, what does a neglecting father symbolize? A neglecting father symbolizes something like rejection and creating something like a lack of self-worth, a lack of attention, a lack of, feeling of being needed, feeling of being desired. Of course, as a child, you want to gain attention. That is the one thing that one of the many things that we truly know about children. They love attention. And if you have somebody who's distant, then you're going to have a problem. What is the representation for that in a boy who has we'll say a mother complex, as Jung would describe it? He doesn't see his mother as something like that. He sees her as comfort, right? He sees her as dependency. He sees her as unconscious bliss. And that's the idea that we just described. And so where does he go for so this is the idea, right? So then what does he project upon Padme? What does he say is, what is Padme's representation? She's also unconscious bliss. She's what his mother is like. And that's why when he goes with Padme, he goes to this place of Naboo. He goes to this place of unconscious paradise. It's because he was never able to, we'll say, release his, need for dependency from the female, we'll say, from the feminine. And this gets perfectly into the idea of the anima, Jung's anima. I've been building up to this idea the entire time. And now this is the point where I explain to you what the anima is in a perfect way, right? So the idea of the anima is very simple, right? For every man, there is a feminine aspect of him, and that is the anima. For every woman, there is a masculine aspect. And this is regardless of gender. It's just, you have these two sides of you. And the idea is very simple. The that need, well, we could say the need for a woman, right? Or also the feminine part of your soul. If you take a masculine personality, which Anakin clearly has done, which 80% of men do, then your need for femininity needs to be, we'll say, fulfilled somewhere. This anima spirit, this feminine part of your soul, or we could just say on a surface level, this need for women needs to be fulfilled somewhere. So as children, right, it's fulfilled by our mothers. Very simple idea. It's like, of course it's going to be filled by our mothers. And we could say our anima, right? Our anima, therefore, we project, right? We project our ideal image of a woman, or we also project our, well, we'll say that. We project our ideal image of a woman upon our mother. Let's assume that our mother is a good person, and we look at our mother as a good person. So, now the question is, just as the idea of a career, right? Just as the idea of a career, when you say, okay, the perfect career is accounting because my parents went into accounting. It's the same idea. The perfect image of a woman is my mother because my mother was perfect, right? Same idea. Now, the question is, you leave your mother, right? You leave your mother. And this is not an archetypal idea. This is a real idea. This is why men end up with women like their mothers. You have your chance to develop the individuality of yourself. You have the chance to separate separate the perfect image of a woman as a motherly figure. Instead, it could be something like a wifely figure, or something like a combination of, we'll say, life and sexual energy, right? Because obviously you're going to want to have a sexual relationship with your wife. It's like, that's about right. So, and obviously you're not going to have that with your mother, right? That's the difference, right? So the woman, right, the woman that you choose, your partner, cannot be your mother, because your mother is only a representation of comfort and unconscious bliss. But when you see your wife, you have to see her as a real person, and also you have to see the full part of them. It has to be a different type of relationship. So when you have to develop this sort of individuality that Anakin has to develop, he decides not to do it. And that's what it means when you have Padme coming in and saying, she says, do you miss your mother, right? And she takes on that role for him. So what happens is he never detaches it. His anima image is still his mother. And, well, Jung would call that as a mother complex. So then we keep going, right? He descends back into unconscious bliss, and then, I don't even think we need that. I think that's really all you need right there. You say, okay, what does he project upon Padme? It's like comfort and something like a motherly instinct, and that's why the characters are so similar. And well, that's the problem. So we'll keep going with this idea. So then he goes back and he realizes that his mother image has died, right? He goes back and he realizes that the perfect representation of a woman is not his mother. And, his desire is to reject change. His desire is not to separate from that idea. And, to simply reject the idea of self-consciousness. And that's exactly what you see in real life. You see this all the time with women who end up with men like their fathers, and men who end up with women like their mothers. And that's the reason why. The reason why is, and the common idea between all three of these is very simple. It's like, you need to think for yourself. You need to develop your own sense of individuality. You need to, become your own person. And that's the purpose of college. That's the purpose of independence. That's the purpose of, becoming an adult. And Anakin, in his refusal to do this, decides that he is not going to become an individual. He's just going to become, let's say, something like a molding of the environment in which he has been surrounded by. There's a strong argument that it's called the deterministic argument. It really says that us humans are just the mold of our environment. That is it. If our environment sets us up in one way, we are just going to be completely molded by it. And, well, you can see that on a grand scale, this is true. It's like being an accountant is a job that nobody would undertake if they weren't paid for it. Can we agree on that? It's like if you weren't paid very highly for being an accountant and it wasn't a very secure job, nobody would be an accountant. But because cultural factors, environmental factors are shifting that perception, or shifting we'll say, environmental influences, people decide to follow that, right? People don't follow, let's say, their individual will to, well, be anything but an accountant. They just follow the culture, and that's what you see with Wall Street bankers. That's what you see with essentially everything. It's like we are modeled by our environment. You can make a strong case that we are very, stimulus happens, there's some incentive that's given, and we just follow it. We unconsciously follow it. But what is the solution to that? That is the argument that Viktor Frankl made in Man's Search for Meaning, where he says, well, what is the reason why the Holocaust happened? The reason why the Holocaust happened is because, very simply, Viktor Frankl was a prisoner in Auschwitz. And he said the reason why we have something like the Holocaust happen is because, well, in Nazi Germany, the societal influences were pushing people towards supporting the Nazi ideology, right? You could have status, you could, well, have money, right? They were poor, they were suffering, they were dying. And you could have money, you could have a scapegoat for all your problems, which is the Jews, and also you could have prosperity. It's like great, 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 and great. And stimulus, response, incentive, reward. But the question is, and this is the real question, it's like, would that be you? Right? Would that be you? There's a book that I read, it's called Ordinary Men, and Jordan Peterson talks about this idea all the time. And he says, well, it's the idea in Ordinary Men is that there were a bunch of ordinary men in Nazi Germany, and they were 35 years old, mostly middle class, mostly blue-collar workers. They didn't ask to be drafted, but they were just drafted. They didn't volunteer to be in the service, but at the same time, they were drafted, and their job was to execute the people in Poland, right? Because I had many of my family die in Poland, and so did many of the people. Like, Poland got absolutely crushed, all of their Jewish population. And there were 500 men in Police Battalion 101, and the guard says, hey, listen, we are going to execute, I think, 10,000 people today in a town. Women, children, all of them. We're going to shoot them all in the back of the head. And out of the 500 people here, if you wish to go, you can go. If you wish to be an individual, if you not cower to conformity, then you can go. And about 10 people left. 490 stayed. 490 people stayed to commit one of the worst atrocities of history. It's like, we have this idea that, oh yes, it's so easy to become an individual. It's so easy to be not influenced by our external environment. It's like, think again. The hardest part is becoming an individual. The hardest part is not cowering to the social pressure. Because think about it, being an accountant is a pretty easy damn life. It's like, okay, I could live $100,000 a year. I don't have to follow my heart, but at the same time, whatever, right? Whatever. Why do I need to follow my heart when I could, well, have status and money and probably a good family from that, and you could say, all right, there we go. But then you're always going to be left with the idea that you never became an individual, you never developed who you are, and you never pursued your potential, and that's the fundamental problem. And well, that's maybe one of the strongest ideas of the idea that we are not individuals and we are just determined by our environment. But the answer is, how could you be part of the 10, right? How could you be part of the 10 that would say, hey, listen, I'm not doing this, right? The people in the Nazi culture that said, I'm not going to be a Nazi, right? I'm not going to be a Nazi. I'm going to fight against Nazi ideology. Most people didn't do that. The default position, let's say, is to be a model of our environment. But the answer is, well, to develop the individual. And that's what Viktor Frankl said. He said, between stimulus and response lies the individual. And there is some potential to make the right decision. There's some potential to go to the good side, we could say. But the Jedis, but the dark side is the path that most people take. That was his argument. The dark side is the path that most people take, and that is the deterministic argument. Most people conform. Most people do not, well, develop their own individual selves. And, well, that's Anakin, right? That's what Anakin does. So he decides to take out his rage in something like anger, where he says, I hate them, right? They're animals, and I slaughtered them like animals. And the unfortunate reality is something like, well, he became an animal in the process. So again, you have the representation of life saying, well, it's angry to be human, right? To be angry is to be human, and he gives this really interesting response. He says, "I'm a Jedi. I know better than this," right? And the idea there is very simple. It's like, he has a conscience. He knows the culture in which he's supposed to be in, right? He knows what the good side consists of, but his actions and his, we'll say, intentions are not the same. And well, that's the fundamental idea of a hero, right? The fundamental, we'll say, conceptualization of a hero. And this is my personal definition, but I think this is a great definition. It's whose thinking and action match up, right? He who thinks and acts willfully in that same manner. And, well, it's not a complete definition, because you could say that's what a school shooter does, or that's what a murderer does, but it's somebody who, well, we could say that and takes that towards the good. One of the fundamental things is that, well, if we're unconscious, if we're not an individual yet, if we haven't developed, we'll say, the control of something like a Jedi, then, well, the person who thinks and the person who acts are separate, right? They're completely different people. And you see this all the time, right? You see this everywhere. It's like, you decide to get married and you create a contract. You're like, we're never going to get divorced. I'm never going to cheat on you either. But about 50% of people get divorced, and about 50% of people cheat on their husbands and wives. So it's like, the person who thinks and the person who makes the plan is not the same person as the person who acts it out. And that's the problem with Anakin. He's too persuaded. He feels too much, and, well, he doesn't know how to... He was never... Well, maybe you could say he was never trained, but you could also say that he never learned how to express his emotions properly. And actually, this is the first time, right? When he's here, he has this. This is the first time that they played the Darth Vader music, right? This is where they play the da 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 da. So that's a problem, right? That's definitely a problem. And, well, there's a little bit more to the plot of the movie, right? So very simply, if you want to understand, this is for the Star Wars, like, to understand how this relates to the world itself. It's like, as this is happening, simultaneously, while this is happening, the Senate gives the Chancellor emergency powers, right? The Palpatine, the Sith, automatically gets emergency powers because of the rising, we'll say, the rising threat, the fear of change in the Republic itself. There's a rising threat, so what do? You sacrifice your principles to retain control of the current situation. And the Jedi were actually okay with that, which I'm surprised about. The Jedi were like, okay, yeah, that's fine. And we could say that's part of their willful blindness. But this is the same idea. The same idea happened in the Republic, and the same idea happens with Anakin. They both sacrificed their principles. They sacrificed the idea of a republic itself. And, well, they did it for security. They did it to in fear of change. And, well, that's why you have the emergence of evil. That's why you have the emergence of someone like Palpatine, who's the Sith. And he says, I'm going to give power back, right? By the time that this crisis is over, I am going to give power back. How noble of him. How incredible, And, well, this really encapsulates the idea. And it's a pretty profound idea. And it's a pretty destructive idea. It's the idea that societies, people, individuals, governments degenerate one sin at a time. One sin at a time. This is, I think it was from the Gulag Archipelago, but I got it from Jordan Peterson. And it's a very simple idea. It's like you think that you're just making a small little mistake. It's like, no. That's one little step towards the dark side. That's one little step. And you could say, this is the smoker idea. It's like when you quit smoking, you think, I could just have one cigarette. Only one little thing. One little slip up. It's really not a big deal. I've been on a really good diet and I could just have one, I could just have one M&M. I could just have one donut. Like, it's really not going to be that big of a deal. This procrastination, it's just a little, I'm just missing 5 minutes. I'm just missing 5 minutes. It's really not terrible. It's not that. It's not that at all. It's that when you do something like that, that's one step. That's one little sin. That's one little step. And, well, that's we'll say the devil leading you in that direction from a metaphorical perspective. Because really think about it. I actually went through this last year. It was really, really funny. So I said, very stressed out, and I was on a really, really healthy diet. And I've been fortunate enough. I've been very good with my diet over the years. But during that time, I was just dying. I was just struggling, and I bought I never eat candy, like never at all. And my whole thing is I don't eat any sugar, right? So I eat only natural sugar, no refined sugar. And what I did was I bought a whole bag of Lifesaver gummies. Maybe like the most junkest of the junk, if we're talking about in terms of just the amount of sugar and the amount of, everything that's in there. It's all processed and all that. So I bought one of those. And we could say that wasn't one sin at a time. That was me going from very, very healthy to like the complete opposite spectrum, right? Because most people kind of, they fall apart. They'll just have like a little piece of sugar, like a little, candy bar or whatever. I just went full thing, about a whole bag of Lifesaver gummies. They tasted gross. They tasted disgusting. And that was because you can't go from 0 to 100. You got to go from 0 to 10 to 20 to 30. And I ended up, I was like, I'm really not even enjoying these Lifesaver gummies. These are actually gross. I used to love them as a kid. That's why I got them. And well, it was actually gross. And while I still had some troubles after that, I definitely had a lot of troubles after that. That was definitely the first breaking of my psychological principle. Taking that big of a jump was too much for my body. My body's like, what are you even giving me? And, well, that's the idea. That's why you slowly degenerate one step at a time. That's why, you say only one smoke. Because if you just smoked a pack tonight, it would be too much of a compromisation. It would be too much. So what you do is you just say one. And then that turns into 2, and that turns into 3. And that's exactly what Anakin's doing here. He takes one little step towards the dark side. We'll say, well, this is a very good way of representing it. Instead of saying that's one little step towards the dark side, it's the seed that plants the tree. It's the seed that plants the tree of evil. And what he's doing here when he says, I hate them, he's really saying, well, I'm planting this little mistake, this little smoke, whatever it is planting the seed to create an entire tree of evil. And that's why you have the Darth Vader music plays for the first time here. It's like, this is the first sin. This is just the one mistake that leads to a catastrophic falling apart. And if we get back to the layer 2 that I spoke of before, it's a very simple idea. It's like whenever you decide to take a drink or You take a drink for the purpose of distracting yourself. Whenever you decide to, procrastinate, whenever you decide to do any of these things, it's not 5 minutes. It's not an hour that you're wasting. It's an idea that's being planted in your mind. And the idea is to escape from the realities of the world. I know where to go. I know where to look. And that 1 hour turns into, 2 hours. And that 2 hours turns into 3 hours a week. And then eventually it turns into, let's say, if you're the average college kid, something like whatever 2.5 times 7 is. Something like 20 hours a week, around there, a little bit less than that. It's like, because 2.5 is the average amount of time that college students spend on social media. It's like, that's what it turns into. This one little idea of, social media won't hurt. It's really not going to be that big of a problem. And it's a great way to connect with your friends. It's like, awesome. That's true. But you got to also look at the dark side of it. You also got to look at the potential for it to, degenerate you. And, that one little step is going to be, that one little procrastination is going to be the thing that degenerates you completely. It's the idea that kills you. And if you've ever watched the movie Inception, that conceptualizes that idea perfectly. It's like, all you got to do is plant a little idea and it changes your behavior completely. Because now, we'll say, when you're doing that, Anakin's model of the world changed. His model of the world is now, I know how to escape the world. And I know how to do it in a way that will make me feel better. And from a psychological perspective, that is called positive reinforcement. You create a positive feedback loop by saying, maybe my suffering is going to cause more suffering, right? That's the problem that you see with someone like somebody who eats too much. It's like, maybe eating too much causes me to gain weight, and then I feel bad. Maybe I eat because eating too much causes me to gain weight, and then I feel worse about myself, so I eat more, and it's just a loop that is never ending, and ends in something like catastrophe, or something like, if we're going to gain from Star Wars perspective, the dark side. So that's what happens. Anakin has the seed that's planted in him that we're going to see play out later. He says, "I wasn't strong enough to save you, Mom." He says that at a funeral. He says, "I wasn't strong enough to save you, Mom." And I'm sure if you've watched that one's pretty self-evident what ends up happening to him as a result. And then we have a little bit more, just now essentially just major plot points. So we have Padme and Anakin get together, right? They get together, and then she kind of falls apart, right? She falls off the ship, right? And he says, "I don't care. Put the ship down. We need to go and save Padme. Make sure she's okay." And Obi-Wan says, "We have a job to do." And that's really what's happening right here. He's saying, "I'm reliant on her. I need her." And right now we could say maybe he has the wrong ideology, right? Right now he's not himself. He's himself represented in her. And you see that in high school relationships all the time. It's when you see this all the time in relationships. It's like two people become so dependent on each other that they don't develop their own individuality. It's like, that's what Anakin is right now. And what ends up happening is Obi-Wan corrects his decision, and we feel good about that because he makes the right choice. But, we don't really feel that good about that because Anakin made the wrong choice in the beginning. And so we could say he was saved by Obi-Wan in this case. And then Anakin gets his arm cut off, right? And Yoda saves him, right? So right now, the very simple idea is that Anakin has no sense of individuality. He needs to be saved by, the culture, by the Yoda, who's the Jedi, who saves him from Count Dooku, and then he has Yoda save him. And then Obi-Wan also saves him from his possession, right? Sort of corrects his ideas, but Anakin still has this problem. He has this lingering thing that's going on. And what we're going to see is, Yoda has connection to the Force. Yoda has connection to Anakin's thoughts. And after this idea, after he had this argument with Obi-Wan, after Anakin had the argument with Obi-Wan, you always see Yoda gives this little, like it always pans to Yoda, who's in a completely different place. And he's like, something's going wrong. And if you've ever seen my Lion King lecture, that's the idea. It's the idea of the self. And it's the idea that, there's a part of Anakin, right? The representation of the self within Anakin is like, nah, something's going wrong here. He's going. This is one sin. This is only one sin, but this has the potential to be a catastrophe, and that is the end. That is the end. They get married, right? They get married, and we could say that this is the solidification of their dependence upon each other, because, well, that's what it is. That's what it ends up being. And well, this is also where Anakin finds his solace, right? He finds his solace in Padme, and, well, we have the beginning of the Clone Wars, and the Clone Wars we are going to talk about in detail in the next few lectures. So we are almost at the end. This is the end of the second movie, and we are moving on to Anakin's decision. We have the war. We have the internal war that Anakin is going to have to really ask himself, who do I want to be? And, well, that's the Clone Wars. That's the third movie. And, well, I'm looking forward to it. So, take care.